The fluorescent lights in Dr. Harrison's office buzzed overhead like angry wasps. As Margaret Chen sat frozen in the leather chair, her weathered hands gripping the armrests until her knuckles turned white. The words he'd just spoken hung in the air between them like a death sentence wrapped in medical terminology. 6 months, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning. You're certain? Dr. Harrison leaned forward, his kind eyes filled with the practiced compassion of someone who'd delivered this news too many times before. I'm afraid so. Margaret, the pancreatic cancer has spread more aggressively than we initially hoped. We can make you comfortable, manage the pain, but Margaret's mind drifted to her son, David, probably sitting in his corner office downtown, buried in quarterly reports and client calls. At 32, he'd built a successful consulting firm from nothing, working 16-hour days that left little room for anything else, including his aging mother. She thought about their small house in Riverside, California, where she'd raised him after his father died when David was 12, the same house where tension had been building for months. Does anyone else know? Dr. Harrison asked gently. No, Margaret shook her head, and I'd like to keep it that way for now. The drive home felt eternal. Margaret's old Honda Civic wheezed through the afternoon traffic on Interstate 91, past strip malls and fast food chains that blurred together like watercolors in rain. She gripped the steering wheel tighter as another wave of nausea hit, the third one since leaving the medical center. The prescription bottle in her purse rattled with each bump in the road, a constant reminder of the pills she'd soon need to take just to function. When she pulled into the driveway of their modest two-story home, David's BMW was already there. Her heart sank. He was home early again, which meant another argument was brewing. The lawn needed mowing, she noticed absently. Another thing she'd been meaning to do but couldn't manage lately. The front door slammed behind her as she entered, the sound echoing through the house like a gunshot. David appeared at the top of the stairs, his tie loosened and his dark hair disheveled. Even from a distance, she could see the frustration etched across his face. Mom, we need to talk, he called down, his voice carrying that edge she'd come to dread. Margaret set her purse on the entry table, her hands trembling slightly. Can it wait, honey? I had a long day at the doctor, and I'm feeling a bit. That's exactly what I want to talk about. David bounded down the stairs, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood. These constant doctor visits? The way you've been moping around the house for weeks? Mrs. Patterson next door told me you haven't been keeping up with the yard work, and frankly, I'm tired of making excuses for you. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She watched her son pace the living room, his hands gesturing wildly as he built up steam. The same living room where she'd helped him with homework, where they'd watched movies together on countless Friday nights, where she'd held him when nightmares woke him after his father's funeral. David, please, if you'd just listen. No. Mom, you listen. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a fury she'd never seen before. I've been patient, I've been understanding, but I can't keep carrying this weight, while you just ... give up on everything. Margaret felt her chest tighten, whether from the cancer or her breaking heart, she couldn't tell. I haven't given up. I'm just going through a difficult time, and you need to pull yourself together. David's voice cracked like a whip through the room. I'm trying to build a life here, maybe start a family with Jessica. But how can I bring anyone home to this? How can I explain to my girlfriend that my mother has turned into this ... this burden? The word burden hit Margaret like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, catching herself on the arm of the couch. In that moment, looking at her son's face twisted with anger and disgust, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. You're right, she said quietly, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her chest. I have become a burden. David blinked, clearly surprised by her sudden agreement. Mom, I didn't mean yes you did. Margaret straightened her shoulders, drawing on a strength she didn't know she still possessed. And maybe it's time I did something about it. She turned and walked toward the stairs, each step feeling like she was climbing a mountain. Behind her, she could hear David calling her name, but his voice seemed to come from very far away. In her bedroom, she pulled out the old suitcase from under her bed, the same one she'd used when she and David's father had taken their honeymoon to Niagara Falls 35 years ago. As she folded her clothes with practiced efficiency, mind raced through possibilities. Her sister Linda lived in Phoenix, but they hadn't spoken in 2 years after a bitter argument about their mother's estate. Her friend Carol from the book club might let her stay for a few days, but Carol's husband had never liked Margaret much. There was always the women's shelter downtown, though the thought made her stomach turn. David appeared in her doorway, his anger replaced by confusion and something that might have been panic. Mom, what are you doing? What you want me to do? Margaret replied without looking up from her packing. I'm leaving. That's not Ty didn't say you had to leave. I just said you said I was a burden. Margaret's voice remained calm, but her hands shook as she folded her favorite sweater, the blue one David had given her last Christmas. And you're right, I am. Mom, please, let's just talk about this. Margaret finally looked at her son. Really? Looked at him. She saw the boy she'd raised, the one who used to climb into her bed during thunderstorms, who'd cried in her arms when the other kids made fun of his thick glasses. But she also saw the man he'd become, successful, driven, and utterly unprepared for the messiness of real life. There's nothing to talk about, she said, zipping the suitcase closed. You've made your feelings clear. The sound of the zipper seemed to echo through the house like a final verdict. Margaret picked up her purse and checked to make sure Dr. Harrison's business card was still tucked inside, along with the prescription she hadn't filled yet. She wouldn't need it where she was going. Mom, where will you go? David's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment he sounded like the scared little boy she remembered. Margaret paused at the bedroom door, her suitcase in one hand and her purse in the other. She looked at her son one last time, memorizing his face, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he was worried, the small scar above his left eyebrow from when he'd fallen off his bike at age 7. Somewhere I won't be a burden, she said softly. The front door clicked shut behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the evening air. Margaret stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the scent of jasmine from Mrs. Patterson's garden and listening to the distant sound of children playing in the neighborhood park. Everything looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but somehow the world felt completely different. She loaded her suitcase into the Honda's trunk and slid behind the wheel. In the rearview mirror, she could see David standing in the living room window, his silhouette backlit by the warm glow of the lamp she'd bought at a garage sale 15 years ago. He wasn't moving, just standing there watching her leave. Margaret started the engine and backed out of the driveway slowly, giving him one last chance to run outside, to call her back, to say he was sorry. But the front door remained closed, and David remained in the window, a statue of regret and stubborn pride as she drove away from the only home she'd known for 2 decades. Margaret felt something unexpected wash over her, not sadness or fear, but a strange kind of relief. For the first time in months, she wasn't pretending to be okay. She wasn't forcing a smile or making excuses for her fatigue. She was simply a woman with 6 months to live, driving into the California sunset with no destination in mind, and all the time in the world the highway stretched ahead of her like an invitation. And Margaret Chun, mother, widow, and keeper of the most devastating secret of her life, pressed her foot to the accelerator and disappeared into the gathering darkness. 3 days. That's how long David Chen stared at his phone, waiting for it to ring. 72 hours of checking his messages every 5 minutes, of jumping at every sound that might be his mother's key in the front door. The house felt like a museum without her, too quiet, too clean, too empty of the small sounds that had become the soundtrack of his life. On Wednesday morning, David sat in his corner office on the 15th floor of the Meridian building in downtown Riverside, staring out at the sprawling city below. The quarterly reports lay untouched on his desk, numbers and projections blurring together as his mind replayed their last conversation over and over again. Burden. Had he really called his own mother a burden? His assistant, Jennifer, knocked and entered without waiting for a response, a privilege earned through 5 years of managing his chaotic schedule. David, you missed the Morrison meeting, and Jessica's called 3 times. She wants to know if you're still on for dinner tonight. David rubbed his temples where a headache had been building since Monday. Cancel dinner. Cancel everything for the rest of the week. Jennifer's eyebrows shot up. In all her years working for him, David had never canceled a client meeting, let alone an entire week's worth. Is everything okay? You see, my mother's missing, David said, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. I mean, she's not missing exactly. She left, but she hasn't called, and I don't know where she went. The concern in Jennifer's eyes was immediate and genuine. She'd met Margaret several times when she'd visited the office, always remembering to ask about Jennifer's kids and complimenting her on her latest achievements. Have you called the police? She's not a missing person. She's a grown woman who left of her own free will because her son is an ass. David's voice cracked on the last word. I need to find her, Jen. I need to apologize. Jennifer sat down in the chair across from his desk, her professional demeanor softening. Tell me what happened? The story came out in fragments, the arguments, the tension, his frustration with his mother's recent behavior, and finally, the night she packed her bag and walked out. With each detail, David felt the weight of his actions settling heavier on his shoulders. She seemed different these past few months, he admitted. Tired all the time, distracted. I thought she was just, I don't know, getting old, maybe depressed. But instead of trying to help her, I made everything worse. Where do you think she might have gone? David had been asking himself the same question for 3 days. She has a sister in Phoenix, but they don't get along. A few friends from her book club, but I called them all. No one's seen her. What about checking her bank account? Credit cards? The suggestion sent a chill through David. He'd never thought to monitor his mother's finances. She'd always been fiercely independent about money. I don't have access to her accounts, but you could find out if she's been using her cards. Right? At least to know she's okay. That afternoon, David found himself sitting across from a bank manager at First National, explaining his situation with growing desperation. Margaret had been careful with her finances, the manager explained, but there had been some unusual activity in recent months. Several large cash withdrawals, payments to medical practices David didn't recognize, and a payment to something called Sunset Gardens just 2 days ago. Sunset Gardens? David frowned. What's that? A quick Google search revealed that Sunset Gardens was a budget motel about an hour north of Riverside, the kind of place that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask too many questions. David's stomach dropped. His mother, the woman who'd raised him in a comfortable middle-class home, who'd worked 2 jobs to pay for his college education, was staying in a motel. The drive to Sunset Gardens felt like the longest hour of David's life. The motel sat on a stretch of highway lined with fast food restaurants and gas stations, its neon sign flickering intermittently in the late afternoon sun. The parking lot was cracked and weedy, dotted with cars that had seen better decades. The desk clerk was a teenager with purple hair and multiple piercings who looked up from her phone with obvious annoyance when David entered. "We don't have any vacancies," she said without looking at him. "I'm not looking for a room, I'm looking for my mother, Margaret Chen. She would have checked in a few days ago." The girl's expression shifted slightly. "You're Mrs. Chen's son." The use of past tense made David's blood run cold. Is she okay? "She checked out this morning, paid for a week, but only stayed 3 nights. The clerk's voice softened. "She seemed really sad. Kept to herself mostly, but she always said please and thank you when I saw her. Not many people do that here." "Did she say where she was going?" "Nah, but..." The girl hesitated, then leaned across the counter. "Look, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but she left something behind. I was gonna throw it away, but it seemed important." She disappeared into the back office and returned with a small notebook. Kind Margaret used for grocery lists and reminders. David's hands trembled as he opened it, recognizing his mother's careful handwriting immediately. The pages were filled with what looked like a journal of sorts, entries dated over the past several weeks. As David read, his world began to shift. On its axis, March 15th, first appointment with Dr. Harrison. More tests needed. Didn't want to worry David with work stress. March 22nd, blood work came back. Not good news. Still waiting for final results. David seems so busy lately. March 29th, biopsy scheduled. Keep hoping it's nothing serious. David snapped at me about the lawn again. Maybe I should hire someone to help. April 5th, results in pancreatic cancer. Advanced stage. Dr. Harrison wants to discuss treatment options, but prognosis isn't good. How do I tell David? He's been so frustrated with me lately. David's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the notebook. Page after page revealed a story he'd never known. Doctor appointments, test results, sleepless nights filled with worry. And through it all, his mother's concern wasn't for herself, but for him. April 12th, David called me a burden today. Maybe he's right. The treatment would be expensive and I'd need someone to drive me to appointments, help with basic things. I can't ask that of him when he's trying to build his life. April 18th, Dr. Harrison says 6 months, maybe less. David doesn't know, and I don't think I can tell him. He has Jessica now, plans for the future. Why should I drag him down with this? The final entry was dated 3 days ago, the night she'd left, April 20th. David's right, I am a burden. But maybe, if I go away, he can remember me as the mother who raised him, not the sick woman who stood in the way of his happiness. I love him too much to watch him resent me through this. Some secrets are kindnesses. David sank into one of the motel's plastic chairs, the notebook falling from his nerveless fingers. Cancer. His mother had cancer. And instead of supporting her, he'd driven her away. Instead of being the son she'd raised him to be, he'd become a stranger, focused on lawn, care, and social appearances, while she faced the most terrifying diagnosis of her life alone. "Mr. You okay?" The desk clerk was watching him with concern. David wiped his eyes, surprised to find them wet. Did she say anything else? Anything about where she might go? The girl thought for a moment. She asked about the bus station. Wanted to know about routes going north? Said something about always wanting to see the redwoods before. Well, she didn't finish the sentence. The redwoods. David remembered now when he was a kid. His mother had always talked about taking a family trip to see the giant sequoias in Northern California. They'd planned it for the summer after his father died, but money had been too tight, and somehow they'd never made it. "Thank you," David said, clutching the notebook to his chest. "Thank you for taking care of her." The girl nodded. "I hope you find her, mister. She seemed like she could use a friend." As David drove back toward Riverside, his phone rang. Jessica's name appeared on the screen, but he let it go to voicemail. He had more important things to do than explain why he'd been absent lately. He had a mother to find, and a lifetime of apologies to make. The notebook sat on his passenger seat, a roadmap of love and sacrifice he'd been too blind to see. Margaret Chen hadn't been a burden, she'd been a mother protecting her son from a truth she thought he couldn't handle. And now, somewhere in the vast expanse of Northern California, she was facing the end of her life alone because he'd convinced her that her love was unwanted. David pressed his foot to the accelerator, racing against time and his own failures. The sun was setting behind him, painting the sky in shades of regret and desperate hope. Tomorrow he would start driving north, following the highway that led to the redwoods and to whatever remained of his relationship with the most important person in his life. But tonight, he would sit in his empty house and read every word his mother had written, learning the story of her courage and his blindness, one heartbreaking page at a time. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop in the small town of Fortuna, California, its brakes hissing like a tired sigh. Margaret Chen gathered her purse and the small overnight bag she'd bought at a thrift store in Sunset Gardens, moving slowly down the narrow aisle. Her body ached in ways that had nothing to do with the 12-hour bus ride from Southern California. The Northern California air was different, hair cleaner, cooler, filled with the scent of pine and something else she couldn't quite identify. It was the smell of ancient things, she realized, of trees that had been standing since before Christopher Columbus was born. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd come to see things that had survived for centuries, just as her own time was running out. The town of Fortuna was smaller than she'd expected, a collection of modest houses and local businesses nestled in the shadow of the towering redwood forests. Margaret found a small motel called the Pinot View Inn, run by an elderly couple who didn't ask questions about why a woman her age was traveling alone with just one bag. "You here for the trees?" asked the innkeeper, a kind-faced woman named Ruth, whose gray hair was pulled back in a practical bun. "I suppose I am," Margaret replied, signing the register with a hand that shook only slightly. "Been running this place for 30 years, and I never get tired of watching people see the redwoods for the first time. There's something about standing next to something that's been alive for 2,000 years, puts things in perspective." Looking out at the forest that began just beyond the motel's parking lot. She'd taken her first dose of the pain medication that afternoon, and the world had taken on a soft, distant quality. That made everything seem more manageable. But for the first time in weeks, she had no words. Instead, she thought about David. Was he worried about her? Had he even noticed she was gone? The questions circled in her mind. Like birds unable to find a place to land, the next morning dawned clear and bright. The kind of perfect California day that belonged on postcards, where the waitress, a young woman about David's age, refilled her coffee without being asked and didn't comment on the fact that Margaret barely touched her eggs. "You heading up to the state park today?" the waitress asked. "I think so," Margaret replied. "I've never seen the redwoods before." The girl's face lit up. "Oh, you're in for a treat. My boyfriend's a park ranger up there, Marcus Williams. If you see him, tell him Stephanie says hi. He gives the best tours." Margaret smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed in days. "I'll do that." The entrance to Humboldt Redwood State Park was marked by a simple wooden sign that seemed almost humble compared to the majesty that lay beyond it. Margaret parked her Honda in the visitor center lot and sat for a moment, gathering her courage. She'd driven nearly 400 miles to see these trees, but now that she was here, she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what lay ahead. The visitor center was staffed by a young man in a ranger uniform whose name tag read Marcus. He looked up from a display of brochures when she entered, his face breaking into the kind of warm smile that reminded Margaret of David when he was younger. "Good morning. First time visiting the redwoods?" "Yes," Margaret said. "A friend of yours, Stephanie, from the cafe in town, said to tell you she says hi." Marcus's smile widened. "That's my girl. She's been trying to get me to bring her family up here for months. Are you looking for any particular trail recommendations?" Margaret had done some research on the bus, reading about the various hiking trails and scenic drives. But now, facing the reality of her physical limitations, she felt suddenly foolish. "Is there a way to see the trees without too much walking?" "Absolutely. But if you're up for just a short walk, maybe a quarter-mile, I'd recommend the Founders Grove. It's got some of the most magnificent trees in the park, and the trail is mostly flat." Something in Margaret's expression must have given away her internal struggle, because Marcus's voice gentled. Tell you what time, heading up that way in about an hour to check on some trail markers. If you'd like some company, I'd be happy. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. That's very generous, but I wouldn't want to impose no imposition at all. It's what I'm here for. Marcus beside her pointing out features of the forest she would have missed on her own. The redwoods rose around them like living cathedrals, their trunks so massive that it hurt her neck to look up at their crowns. This one here, Marcus said, stopping beside a tree that dwarfed everything around it, is called the Founder's Tree. It's over 350 feet tall and probably close to 1,500 years old. Margaret placed her palm against the deeply grooved bark, feeling the incredible solidity of it. The tree had been alive when her ancestors were still in China, when America was inhabited only by native tribes, when the very concept of her own existence was an impossibility stretching across centuries of future. It's overwhelming, she whispered. Marcus nodded. I've been working here for 3 years, and I still get that feeling. There's something about being in the presence of something so much larger and older than yourself. Makes your problems feel, I don't know, different somehow? Wind through branches hundreds of feet above their heads. Margaret found herself breathing more easily than she had in weeks, the pain in her chest seeming less urgent somehow. Can I ask you something? She said as they paused beside a fallen giant that had created a natural bridge across a small creek. Of course. Do you ever think about time? I mean, really think about it? Marcus considered the question seriously. What do you mean? Margaret struggled to put her thoughts into words. These trees, they've been here for centuries. They've watched civilizations rise and fall, seen countless generations of people live and die. It makes me wonder about the significance of any single human life in the grand scheme of things. They sat down on a bench that had been carved from another fallen redwood, its surface smooth from years of visitors. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his young face thoughtful. You know, he said finally, I had a philosophy professor in college who used to say that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us. But I think that's what makes individual lives so precious, not because they're significant too, the cosmos, but because they're significant to us. Margaret looked at him with surprise. That's very wise for someone your age. Marcus laughed. Don't give me too much credit. I spend a lot of time out here thinking about big questions. The trees are good listeners. Do you have family? My parents live in Sacramento. I have a younger sister who's finishing up nursing school. His voice took on a warmer tone. And Stephanie, of course. We're talking about getting married next year. The casual mention of marriage sent a pang through Margaret's chest. They worry about me being so far from home, but they understand that this is what I love doing. Marcus glanced at her sideways. What about you? Do you have family? Margaret was quiet for so long that Marcus began to apologize for the personal question, but she held up a hand to stop him. I have a son, she said finally. David. He's successful, driven, everything a mother could want. But lately, I feel like I've become more of a burden to him than a blessing. I doubt that's true. You'd be surprised. Margaret's voice carried a weight that made Marcus study her more carefully. Sometimes, when you love someone, the kindest thing you can do is step out of their way. Their children's excited voices echoing off the massive tree trunks. Margaret found herself envying their obvious joy, their simple pleasure in the moment. Mrs. Chen, Marcus said suddenly, and Margaret realized she must have introduced herself earlier. Can I tell you something my grandmother used to say? Margaret nodded. She always told me that love isn't something you can use up. It's not like there's only so much to go around. The more you give, the more there is. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. But that usually just guarantees the hurt they were trying to avoid. Margaret felt tears sliding down her cheeks before she realized she was crying. What if it's too late? What if you've already pushed them so far away that they can't find their way back? Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. This might sound crazy, but would you mind if I gave you my number? Not for anything weird, he added quickly, seeing her expression. It's just I get the feeling you could use a friend right now, and I'm a pretty good listener when I'm not giving unsolicited advice. Margaret took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. That's very kind of you. The offer goes both ways. If you ever need someone to talk to or if you need help with anything at all, please don't hesitate to call. They walked back toward the visitor center as the afternoon shadows grew longer, the golden light filtering through the redwoods and shafts that looked like cathedral windows. Marcus, she said as they reached her car, thank you. For today, for the tours, for ... everything. It was my pleasure. Mrs. Chen, I hope you'll come back before you head home. Margaret smiled, though she knew this might be the last time she saw this beautiful place. I hope so too. In her rearview mirror, the redwoods stood sentinel against the evening sky, ancient and patient. They had witnessed countless human dramas play out in their shadows: love and loss, birth and death, the endless cycle of connection and separation that defined the human experience. For the first time since Dr. Harrison had delivered his devastating news, Margaret began to wonder if she'd made the right choice in running away. The trees had taught her something about endurance, about the power of standing tall in the face of storms. Maybe, she thought, it was time to stop running and start reaching toward whatever light remained that night. In her small motel room, Margaret pulled out her phone and stared at David's number for a long time. Her finger hovered over the call button, but in the end she set the phone aside. She wasn't ready yet. But for the first time in weeks, she could imagine a future where she might be. David's phone rang at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after his mother had disappeared. He'd been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom, the same room he'd moved back into after selling his downtown condo. Unable to bear the thought of living anywhere else while Margaret was missing, the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize, but he answered anyway. Every unknown call might be news about his mother. "Is this David Chen?" The voice was young, male, with a slight accent David couldn't place. "Yes, who is this?" "My name is Marcus Williams. I'm a park ranger up in Humboldt County. I think I've been spending time with your mother." David shot upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Is she okay? Where is she?" She's been better. Mr. Chen, I think you need to come up here. There are some things you need to know." The drive to Northern California was a blur of highway miles and desperate hope. Marcus had been vague about Margaret's condition, saying only that she'd been visiting the Redwoods regularly over the past 2 weeks and that she'd mentioned David several times. What worried David most was what Marcus hadn't said: that she was fine, that she was taking care of herself, that she wanted to come home. David found Marcus waiting in the visitor center parking lot, a young man with kind eyes and the sort of patient demeanor David associated with people who spent their lives outdoors. They shook hands and David was surprised by the firmness of the ranger's grip. "Thank you for calling," David said. "I've been looking for her for weeks." Marcus nodded toward a trail that disappeared into the towering trees. "She's up there. About a quarter mile, Mr. Chen. Before we go, there's something you should know. Your mother is sick. Really sick." The words hit David like cold water, even though part of him had been expecting them. "The cancer?" Marcus's eyebrows shot up. "You know, I found her journal. She'd been hiding it from me." David's voice cracked slightly. "I've been such an idiot. Marcus, I thought she was just, I don't know, getting old, being difficult. I had no idea she was facing something like this alone." "She wasn't entirely alone," Marcus said gently. "She's been coming here almost every day. We talk. She's told me a lot about you. Nothing good, I'm sure. Actually, that's not true at all." Marcus started walking toward the trail, his pace slow and measured. "She talks about you constantly. Your achievements, your business, how proud she is of the man you've become. But she also talks about how worried she is that she's holding you back." They walked in silence for a few minutes, the massive redwoods creating a natural cathedral. Around them, David had never been in a forest like this before. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming, the silence so complete it seemed to echo. "There," Marcus said softly, pointing ahead. David followed his gaze and saw her. Margaret sat on a fallen log about 50 yards away, her back to them, wearing the blue sweater he'd given her for Christmas. She looked smaller than he remembered, more fragile, as if the week since she'd left had carved something essential from her frame. "Mom," David whispered, but she was too far away to hear. "She comes here to think," Marcus said. "Says the trees help her put things in perspective." David started toward her, but Marcus caught his arm. "Mr. Chen, David, she's scared. Not of dying, but of hurting you. Be gentle with her." David nodded, not trusting his voice. He walked slowly toward his mother, his footsteps soft on the forest floor. When he was about 10 feet away, she stiffened as if sensing his presence. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly. Margaret turned and David felt his heart break all over again. She was thinner than when she'd left, her cheeks hollow, her eyes carrying a weight that seemed almost unbearable. But when she saw him, her face lit up with a mixture of joy and terror that made his chest ache. "David," she breathed. "How did you? I've been looking for you." He sat down beside her on the log, careful not to move too quickly. "I found your journal. Mom, why didn't you tell me?" Margaret's hands fluttered to her lap, smoothing her skirt with nervous energy. "I didn't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden." The words came out more forcefully than he'd intended, echoing off the massive tree trunks around them. "Mom, you're my mother. You raised me, sacrificed everything for me, and when you needed me most, I failed you completely." Margaret shook her head, tears sliding down her cheeks. "No, honey, you didn't fail." "Yes, I did. David's voice broke. I called you a burden. I made you feel like your illness was an inconvenience to my life instead of the most important thing in the world. I'm so sorry, Mom. I'm so incredibly sorry. They sat in silence for a moment, the ancient redwoods standing witness to a conversation decades in the making. A slight breeze moved through the canopy hundreds of feet above them, creating a sound like whispered prayers. How long? David asked finally. Margaret's voice was barely audible. Dr. Harrison said 6 months when I first got the diagnosis. That was 2 months ago. 4 months. David felt the number settle in his chest like a stone. For months to make up for a lifetime of taking her for granted, for months to be the son she deserved? What's the treatment plan? He asked, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. There isn't one, Margaret said simply. It's too advanced. They can manage the pain, make me comfortable, but no. David turned to face her fully. No, that's not acceptable. There have to be options. Clinical trials, experimental treatments. David, please. Margaret's voice carried a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. I've made my peace with this. Well, I haven't. David stood up abruptly, pacing in front of the fallen log. Mom, you don't get to just give up. You don't get to decide that your life isn't worth fighting for. It's not about giving up. Then what is it about? David's voice cracked with frustration and fear. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've decided to die alone in the woods rather than let me help you. Margaret was quiet for so long that David wondered if she was going to answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he had to strain to hear her. I wanted you to remember me as I was, she said. Strong, capable, the mother who could fix anything. I didn't want your last memories of me to be of some sick old woman who couldn't take care of herself. David felt his knees go weak. He sank back down beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. Mom, don't you understand? My best memories of you aren't from when you were strong. They're from when you were human. Margaret looked at him with confusion. I remember when Dad died, David continued. And you cried for 3 days straight. You thought you were hiding it from me, but I could hear you in your room at night. And you know what? That's when I learned that it was okay to be sad, that grief was just love with nowhere to go. A sob escaped Margaret's throat. I remember when you got food poisoning from that sketchy Chinese restaurant, and you were so sick you could barely lift your head. But you still made sure I had breakfast before school, even though you could barely stand up. That's when I learned what real strength looked like. David reached for his mother's hand, finding it smaller and more fragile than he remembered. And I remember last Christmas, when you fell asleep on the couch during the movie we were watching, you had frosting in your hair from decorating cookies with me, and you were snoring just slightly. That's when I realized that the most beautiful thing about you wasn't your strength, it was your humanity. Margaret was crying openly now, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. David pulled her against his chest, holding her the way she'd held him through countless childhood heartbreaks. I don't want to be a burden, she whispered against his shirt. You could never be a burden? David whispered back. You're my mother. Taking care of you isn't an obligation, it's a privilege. They held each other in the shadow of the ancient trees, two people trying to find their way back to each other across a chasm of fear and misunderstanding. Around them, the redwoods stood silent and patient, having witnessed countless human reconciliations in their centuries of life. I'm scared, Margaret admitted. I know I'm scared too. David pulled back to look at her face. But we don't have to be scared alone anymore. Marcus appeared on the trail, walking quietly toward them. When he saw their embrace, he started to turn away, but David called out to him. Marcus, thank you for taking care of her, for calling me. I don't know how to repay you. The young ranger smiled. Just take care of each other. That's payment. Enough. There's something else, Margaret said, pulling away from David slightly. I need to tell you about the money. David frowned. What money? Your college fund? The money your father left for your education? Margaret's voice was steady now, as if having made the decision to be honest had given her new strength. I used it for the medical bills these past few months. The insurance doesn't cover everything, and I didn't want you to know how expensive the tests were. David stared at her in disbelief. Mom, Dad's been dead for 20 years. I graduated from college 15 years ago. I know, but I kept that. Money separates all these years. It was supposed to be for emergencies, for your future family. For taking care of you when you got sick, David finished gently. Mom, that's exactly what Dad would have wanted that money used for. Margaret shook her head. But it was your inheritance. My inheritance is sitting right here, David said firmly. It's having a mother who loved me enough to work 2 jobs, who saved every penny for my education, who worried more about my future than her own comfort. The money doesn't matter, Mom, you matter. They talked for another hour, sitting in the Cathedral of Redwoods, while David learned the full scope of His mother's illness, and Margaret began to accept that she didn't have to face it alone. Marcus eventually joined them, sharing stories about the trees and the healing power of nature that felt like a blessing over their reunion. "I want to take you home," David said as the afternoon light began to slant through the forest. "I want to take you to the best doctors, get second opinions, explore every option." Margaret nodded slowly. "But first, I want to stay here for a few more days. These trees, they've taught me something about endurance, about standing tall even when the storms come. I want to learn a little more from them before I go." David looked around at the massive redwoods, understanding for the first time why his mother had been drawn to this place. There was something about their ancient presence that put human struggles into perspective, not by making them seem insignificant, but by reminding you that you are part of something larger and more enduring than your individual pain. "Then we'll stay," he said. "As long as you want." That evening, they sat together on the small porch of Margaret's motel room, watching the sunset behind the towering trees. David had called Jessica to explain where he'd been, had rescheduled his meetings for the rest of the week, had essentially put his entire life on hold. And for the first time in months, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. "David," Margaret said as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, "I need you to promise me something. Anything. When the time comes, when the treatments stop working, or I decide I've had enough, I need you to let me go with dignity. I need you to understand that death isn't failure, it's just the end of the story." David felt his chest tighten, but he nodded. "I promise. But in return, I need you to promise me something too." "What's that?" "Promise me you'll fight? Really fight. Not for me, not for anyone else, but for yourself. Promise me you'll squeeze every moment of joy and love and beauty out of whatever time we have left." Margaret smiled, the first truly peaceful smile David had seen from her in months. "I promise." They sat in comfortable silence as the night settled around them, the ancient redwoods standing guard like silent sentinels. In the distance, they could hear the soft sounds of the forest settling into evening, the call of nightbirds, the whisper of wind through branches, the eternal music of life continuing in all its forms. Margaret reached for David's hand, and he took it gratefully, marveling at how much had changed in the space of a single conversation. This morning, he'd been a son, searching desperately for his lost mother. Tonight, he was simply a man holding hands with the most important person in his world, surrounded by trees that had weathered centuries of storms and still reached toward the light. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly. "I love you too, sweetheart," Margaret replied. "I always have, and I always will." Above them, the redwoods stretched toward the star-filled sky, ancient witnesses to the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. In their shadow, a mother and son began the process of learning how to say goodbye with bitterness or regret, but with gratitude for all the time they'd had and determination to make the most of. Whatever time remained, the next morning would bring difficult conversations with doctors, treatment plans, and the hard work of rebuilding their relationship on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. But tonight, they were simply together, and that was enough. In the end, Margaret Chen had found what she'd come to, the redwoods seeking not just peace with her mortality, but the understanding that love isn't diminished by illness or burden, or the approach of death. If anything, it grows stronger in the face of loss, more precious for its fragility, more beautiful for being temporary. And David had learned something too, that being a son wasn't just about celebrating your mother's strengths, but about honoring her vulnerabilities, supporting her fears, and standing with her in the shadow of the unknown. The redwoods had taught them both about endurance, not the kind that faces storms alone, but the kind that grows stronger by intertwining roots with those who matter most. As the stars wheeled overhead and the ancient forest settled into its nightly rest, Margaret and David Chen held hands and planned for a future that would be shorter than they'd hoped, but richer than they'd ever imagined possible. In the morning, they would begin the journey home together, carrying with them the lessons learned in the shadow of giants, that love is not measured in years but in moments, and that the most profound connections are often forged in the crucible of shared struggle. The redwoods stood witness to it all, as they had for centuries before and would for centuries to come, silent guardians of the truth that some things endure beyond the span of any single life, and that love, in all its forms, is the most enduring of all. 6 months later, David stood in the backyard of their riverside home, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The garden Margaret had planted in the spring was in full bloom, now roses and jasmine and the lavender she'd always loved. She'd insisted on planting it herself, even when her hands shook too badly to hold the small tools properly. She would have loved this morning, Jessica said softly, joining him on the patio with 2 cups of coffee. David accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping his arms around the woman who had stood by him through the hardest months of his life. She did love mornings like this, said they reminded her that every day was a gift, even the difficult ones. Margaret had lived for 7 months after their reunion in the Redwoods, longer than Dr. Harrison had predicted, and filled with more love and laughter than David had thought possible. They'd traveled together, taken the road trip to see the Grand Canyon she'd always talked about, spent countless hours just sitting and talking about everything and nothing. The end, when it came, had been peaceful. Margaret had died in her own bed, surrounded by the people who loved her most, including Marcus, who had driven down from Northern California to say goodbye. Her last words had been about the Redwoods, about how standing among them had taught her that endings could be as beautiful as beginnings if you faced them with courage and love. "I miss her," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "I know," Jessica replied, squeezing his hand. "But look at what she left behind." David followed her gaze to the garden, to the house filled with memories and photographs, to the life he was building with the woman he loved, life his mother had lived long enough to bless. Margaret's legacy wasn't just in the tangible things she'd left behind, but in the lessons she'd taught him about love and sacrifice and the courage to be vulnerable with the people who mattered most. In his pocket, David carried a small piece of redwood bark that Marcus had given him, a reminder of the place where he'd learned to be a son again, where love had proven stronger than fear, and where the ancient trees had taught them both about the kind of endurance that really mattered. The sun climbed higher, bathing the garden in warm light, and David Chen smiled through his tears, knowing that wherever his mother was now, she was finally free from pain and surrounded by the eternal love she'd spent her life giving to others. The story of Margaret and David Chen had ended, but the love that had written it would continue, growing and spreading like the roots of the giant redwoods, invisible but unbreakable, connecting past and future in the endless cycle of human connection. And in that connection, Margaret Chen lived on, not just in memory, but in every act of love and forgiveness that her story had made possible.